Welcome to another episode of Afterlife Mysteries. I'm Kalila Smith, and joining me is going to be my co-host, Billy Roberts. Hello, Billy. How are you?
Hi, Kalila. Nice to be back again.
It's wonderful to have you back. We're going to be talking about a lot of fun stuff today because we're going to talk about why do we have mediums in paranormal investigations? There's a lot of paranormal groups out here. There's a lot of television shows about paranormal investigations, ghost hunting and so forth. And I've met over the last 30 years, I have met many groups and individuals who stick strictly with the scientific end of a paranormal investigation. And a lot of people don't realize why. Why have mediums involved in paranormal investigations? And it actually can be very advantageous to have that mediumship edge coming in alongside the scientific. It doesn't replace it, but it's always good to have both. Don't you think, Billy?
Yeah, I totally agree. But I think mediums have always been an integral part of the paranormal. The problem I have with paranormal groups is they're playing on an emotional and psychological minefield. And without the expertise of a medium present, then it's meaningless. The whole thing becomes subjective. A medium brings everything to life. And but not in saying that, not all mediums are genuine. I mean, I always stick my neck out and say, look, there's only about, I would say 50, maybe 45% of mediums are genuine. And I blame the media for this, the television and radio, because they've made it all exciting. And mediums, mediums
Right.
have a particular role to play in the manifestation of the paranormal, and but it's finding a genuine one and a good one. But paranormal groups, I am totally against, and which is why I've become known as the skeptical medium. I've got to say
But
it. I
it's
mean,
good. It's good to be skeptical at times. We even have our own, Alan being our in-house skeptic at all
yeah,
times. But yeah,
we
it's
need
good. You have to play
we
devil's
need,
advocate.
we need skeptics, but from my perspective, there's no such thing as a skeptic, because somebody will say to me, well, do you believe in all this? You don't think it's real, do you? And I'll look at them, and then they'll say to me, but there was this one time. Every skeptic has this one time when they've experienced something that cannot be explained. And I've met many of them. So mediumship is an unusual, it's unreliable. It's probably the most unreliable of all paranormal skills because it doesn't always work. And any medium who claims to be able to communicate with your deceased mother, brother, daughter, who claims every time it's going to be successful, they're either lying or they're not real.
Right. Well, a lot of things that people don't realize is that when you're doing paranormal investigations, there are different types of hauntings. Not all hauntings are intelligent spirits that you can speak to. They're not all
Exactly.
actually the dead who have crossed over and gone through the light. You've got discarnate spirits that are on the earth plane that are lower vibrational. But I think over 90% of all hauntings are actually residual energy. They're, I think you may have a different name for it, but I've always called it and heard it called a residual haunting. It used
Mm-hmm.
to be called a shade, but
Yeah.
these are not an actual ghost present, but an energetic impression left from a very strong emotion or a trauma or even a repetitive action like the shutter that keeps slamming over and over again or the rocking chair that continues to rock after grandma has passed. These are all residual hauntings, and you've done a lot of work
Yeah.
with the residual hauntings, right?
Yeah. Over the years. I mean, the stone tape theory is the scientific belief that everything is encapsulated in bricks and mortar. And most of these paranormal happenings do occur where, but close to water in a damp environment, grey stone or sandstone. And if you can imagine that as a videotape and an audio tape they're coated with a fine substance, electromagnetic substance. We know that the air is filled with the same substance, electromagnetic energy. And it's this energy that precipitates these images from the past. As you said, you call them residual. So they're like photographic images in the atmosphere. And certain individuals can see them. But a person who's not trained, a person who has a rudimentary form of psychism, they misconstrue it as the actual entity. But these images don't have any consciousness. They're not aware of you. They're not aware of your presence. They're just floating in the atmosphere. And this is why in places like Chester in the UK and in Bath in the UK, Roman towns, people excavating the sewers over the years have seen a battalion of Roman soldiers walking across their path. But these Roman soldiers were only visible up from the knees. And when they excavated it further, they found that the original Roman road was lower down. So these battalion of Roman soldiers were not aware of the workmen. They were just going about their daily routine, at the habitual side of life. Everything they did every day is replayed, just like watching a video recording. And then you've got something called triboluminescence, which is a geological phenomenon. And this is something that takes place below ground. It's the friction caused by two minerals or crystals rubbing together. And that precipitates the electromagnetic atmosphere and will release a lot of different paranormal visual things and audio phenomena. So you really got to have a good head on your shoulders, and you've got to be a little bit skeptical and make a detailed analysis of the things you're seeing. So it's not enough to have a mediumistic ability. You do have to have some knowledge of the scientific facts and the paranormal itself.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It all works together. I was always amazed at people who were doing just the scientific end, using a few meters, some thermometers, and they say, well, I don't believe in having the spiritual stuff there. And it's like, but you're working with spirits. So what is it exactly are you looking for? If not spirits, and what it comes down to with paranormal groups is that they have to understand is that you're not there to remove anything. You're not there to fix anything. You're just documenting. That's really all they can do is document their findings. And,
exactly.
Sometimes their findings are inconclusive. Was it actually a haunting that was, an intelligent entity, or was it residual? And 9 times out of 10, it's going to be residual. Now, that does not mean that it's any less haunted. A residual haunting can be very, very strong. I've actually had situations, Bailey, where I have been in very negative residual hauntings and have become ill from it. Classic example, there's a bar in New Orleans. There was a bar called the Upstairs Lounge. And it was on Charter Street. It was above another lounge that still exists. And back in I think it was the 80s, on Sundays, it was being used by a church group. Now, this was a gay bar, and it was a gay church group that was using the bar on Sunday mornings to have their church services while they were waiting for their church to be built. So they were in there having their church service, and this turned out to be one of the biggest hate crimes in the history of New Orleans. This was back in the day where they had they had bars on windows upstairs to keep people from breaking in because you had fire escapes. And they also had something where you would have, when you had an upstairs building, you'd have a stairwell that you would go into. And they would come out and they would lock the door and close the latch and put a padlock on it. So it was very easy for someone to lock people into their businesses.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't give it a whole lot of thought. And consequently, what happened on the morning of one of the most horrific fires ever, while they were in there having their church service, a person who, for whatever reason, decided to throw a Molotov cocktail into the stairwell and then padlock the door locked. Then what he did was he called the bar upstairs and he said, someone called for a cab. Now these people are in the middle of a church service and they're like, I didn't call for, did anyone here call for a cab? And everybody's like, no, no. And one gentleman got up and he said, well, I'll go see. And when he opened that door to that stairwell, the backdraft sucked in a ball of fire that just was devastating. I mean, it was one of the most, it's amazing that there were actually survivors of this horrific event. A lot of them died trying to get through the bars on the window. It was just absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
There was actually a few survivors to it, but it was, you know, it was the catalyst that caused them to change the way fire escapes were, to change the way bars on windows, to prevent people from having, you know, a flip lock to where you could just put a padlock on it. A lot of changes were made to building codes because of this horrible, horrible tragedy. And needless to say, it was a very, you know, tragic deaths, violent deaths. I mean, a fire, it was horrible, and very, very strong emotions that were involved. So it's, you know, this hotbed for a residual haunting. And I do not, and I know, I don't say I believe, but I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, these people did not get trapped in these buildings. Nobody's trapped in this earth plane. These people did pass on, of course. But many years later, there was a paranormal group in town with a woman that I knew. And it was Halloween time. I was very, very busy with tours. I was teaching at University of New Orleans, a paranormal class. And I was pretty exhausted. I didn't really want to open myself up to anything at the time. And they begged me to go along. They said we were able to get into the upstairs lounge. And I said, well, okay, I tell you what. Now, this is where I was very foolish back then. This was back in the 90s. And I said, okay, I said, but I'm really, really not up to doing anything that's going to be communicating or anything like that. I said, I will stand in the background and I'll just videotape. Well, you know as well as I do what happened. I mean, I'm in there and I've got a video camera and I'm videotaping things, and suddenly, you know, I get what I call the psychic blind side. All of a sudden, poof, I am hit. And I'm seeing this man his face is melting off. He's got his arms held out and he's going, help me, help me, help me. And I'm smelling the smoke and I'm starting to choke, and literally had a physical reaction to what was going on in there. I wound up with an upper respiratory situation going on for 3 weeks after that. It took me 3 weeks to recover from exposing myself to that type of negative energy. And I didn't ground myself good enough. And I shouldn't have even really gone in there, but it was really a awakening for me to realize that I would rather encounter a negative entity that is intelligent than a residual haunting. I mean, because many of these negative residual hauntings are just tremendous. Have you ever had that happen where you were just, you know, hit with something?
Oh, yeah. Quite a lot. I did a TV series called Billy Roberts Investigates Paranormal some years ago. And I was called to a house in a place called Birkdale, which is a suburb of Liverpool. And the house was hit by a poltergeist. Cut a long story short, it was like World War III had taken place. And I couldn't ascertain what the problem was until later on. I found that there'd been a couple of weird fatalities. An old man had died there. He'd been ill with cancer. And a young guy had hanged himself from the banister, the stairwell. And it wasn't the fact that he was haunting or the old man was haunting. It was the energy that they had created over the years. And it had been left. It was dormant. And it was precipitated by a young girl who lived in an apartment upstairs. And she had a young baby. Now, we know that females up to the age of 12 can have an interaction with these energies. And it was all to do with that. The atmosphere in this building was horrendous. A couple of clairvoyants had been there, and they'd been violently sick. And I, too, was sick. But the phenomena that was created by this energy, although it wasn't intelligent, was incredible, because a vase actually lifted from a windowsill and actually shot off onto the floor but didn't break. All these different crazy things. But it left an image in my mind. I thought, well, I don't want to, this is not something I want to do. But I did prophesy that the house would be sold to a German businessman, and they'd knock the building down eventually and build a home for the elderly, which happened. But when by demolishing bricks and mortar, as you know, you can't eradicate the paranormal activity. It will persist for God knows how long, even
Right.
with a new build. Then that's what happened. But that's just one case. And so the paranormal is an emotional minefield. And although a lot of people tend to look upon it as a bit of fun, a bit of a hoo-ha, we know otherwise, and we know that it can be quite damaging psychologically to certain
Yes, it
people.
can. It can. I've seen people. I've experienced people. People close to me, because I've taught classes for so long, teaching people the paranormal, and I would explain to them, this is just a basic 101 class. I mean, this is not something where you take a class for 6 weeks and then you know everything. I mean, it's impossible. It's years and years and years of, and a lot of it's trial by error, especially when I was coming into this. There were no television shows. There was very little written about it, and it was a lot of trial by error. And so I see people getting into these pitfalls, and I have seen people become very damaged by getting involved with things that they don't really understand. And you talked about a poltergeist, and that's another area, because there's different types of hauntings. You've got your intelligent haunting, you've got a residual haunting, and a third type of haunting is the poltergeist. And we hear a
Yeah,
lot about this. This has been made famous by Hollywood, the movie Poltergeist itself,
exactly.
and then just take the ball and run with it, with you know millions of television shows and movies that have been written about poltergeist. And the word itself, poltergeist, means noisy ghost. It's a German word, and it means noisy ghost. And a lot
Yeah,
of us associate a poltergeist with an entity that's trapped, and they're unhappy, and they're grabbing books and throwing them and throwing things across the
yeah,
room. But as you said, and that's interesting, because I always figured with poltergeist, I know lots of times that can be telekinetic energy coming from someone in the house, and there's been a lot of recorded cases of that as well. Lots of times a poltergeist is not necessarily even anything to do with anyone who has died.
exactly.
Have you found a lot of cases with that as well?
Yeah, I've experienced where there was a young man, he was probably about 22, 23, and his mother had sent for me to have a word with him because he had a telekinetic ability, which means he could move or seemingly move objects with his mind without actually intending to do it. And it created all kinds of phenomena because he had a psychological problem. He was actually diagnosed as a schizophrenic, and he had other issues as well. But he had an ability which I think was a low grade mediumistic ability, but it aired on the malevolent side because he had a malevolent streak, this guy, and it had to be helped. But I mean, first of all, the psychiatrist had to help him. He was highly medicated, but he was in the habit of withdrawing his medication because it gave him a
Oh
high.
yeah.
And it was at that point he could do all kinds of things, strange things with his mind. I mean, that's just one example, but you do have to be very careful. And people with a tendency to have psychological problems should not be involved in the paranormal, my opinion anyway, because it can precipitate all kinds of problems. I think you have to be very careful who you're training because changes do occur, as you know. Changes occur in the brain and the nervous system when you develop your psychic skills. And once these changes are established, then they can't be reversed. They're there. You have to use them in one way or another. And I've had them in our center where people have come along and they obviously have skills, but they're not right psychologically. So I put them into a meditation class and teach them the art of meditation, chanting or whatever. because it helps to stabilize them. So it is. It's a
Yeah, yeah, you have to be grounded. Yeah, I mean, I remember in my, earlier years, I mean, I had abilities as a child, which I turned off throughout my teen years and my 20s. And I would still have things, I'd hear things around my house. And, I'd hear, after my parents passed away, I'd hear the door opening, closing, I'd hear the footsteps. I moved 800 miles away, and I still had things happening. And I finally realized it wasn't the house, it was me. And when I first started, when I made the decision to open back up and really start developing, and we're talking about, my late 20s, early 30s,
yeah.
it was a very emotional thing to go through. There was this huge emotional upheaval that came on. And, but I was doing a lot of right brain things at the time, even though I was working. But I was involved in ballet and dance my whole life, and music and art and that sort of thing, and writing, and all of these things were helping me kind of process through. But I can see where somebody who's just coming on that cusp of wanting to, open those doors to the psychic abilities and to mediumship, and that was just the tip of the iceberg back there for me. But it was, several years of very, very huge emotional upheaval and transitions that were going on. And it kind of stayed a little unstable for a while, and then it started kind of gradually balancing back out. And then when I hit about 41, 42, there was this quantum leap. It was almost like this huge jump that I made. And all of a sudden, something else opened up. And that was when I became clairvoyant. I had been clairsentient all along, feeling things and sensing things. But when I truly became clairvoyant, I was in my early 40s. And it was just, and I'll never forget when it happened. I mean, I was actually giving a tour, and I was in front of a haunted building, and just like all of a sudden, it was like someone turned on a light switch and something clicked inside of me. And I just felt this huge, this jump. And it was like, oh, wow, I just saw something that nobody else saw. And it was, by that time, I was able to, handle those kind of changes, and it wasn't so much emotional. It was actually just, I was awestruck at the time.
Yeah, meeting, it's strange, really, because anecdotal accounts of people's lives matter very little to me. I mean, I know you quite well now, but people come and they want to tell you the whole history of the experiences they've had, as though it was all new, and it would be new to me. And you like me, you've heard it all before. But mediumship is unusual in as much as it's the most unreliable ability, and it doesn't always work.
Right.
For many different reasons. A medium is only as good as the audience or the person they work with. I can't make Alan, for example, or anybody say yes to the information I'm giving. I can only surmise that I know that I'm right. So mediumship is subjective. Now, you mentioned clairsentience. Clairsentience is the most common of all paranormal abilities.
Right.
And it's the one most people have, but it's the most underestimated, because I've seen clairsentient mediums giving detailed information about the coloring, the name of the person, how they died, everything about their life. And, if they say, well, I'm clairsentient, you think, well, how could you give all this information if you don't hear anything, you don't see anything? That's because it encompasses all the ability combined. Clairaudience is the ability to hear, but most people think it's a voice. All the time it's a voice, and it isn't. It can be extraneous thoughts, a sequence of thoughts streaming into your brain, thoughts that you know they're not yours, but you might be involved in making the evening meal, thinking about what you're going to do the next day. And all of a sudden, Auntie Jenny comes into your mind, or your mother, and you think, why? And that's because Auntie Jenny or your mum is there. And the only way they can communicate is via your mind. And once you acknowledge that, it will open up other things for you.
Right. And I noticed also that, and for any budding mediums out there, if you are mediumistically inclined, because it's different to be psychic. Psychic, a lot of people are psychic and not necessarily mediums, but mediums are usually psychic. And I also found that my medium skills became more refined the more psychic readings I did, because it got to the point. I mean, I started off, in my 20s doing readings with tarot cards, and I would just, use the cards as I never I'm not talking about using tarot cards and memorizing what the book says that means, but you really using the cards as tools, as symbols to trigger saying something about the person and being spot on. But I noticed that after many, many years of doing this, that when I would give a reading, lots of times I would just grab the cards, put them in a stack, and set them aside and say, okay, so and so's telling me this. And I became somewhat clairaudient in that I would always get someone speaking into the left ear. And I always thought that was very odd, because the left ear was the one I had the most infections in as a child, and
Yeah.
not my best ear. So, but even in my early 20s, sometimes I'll never forget the time that it was a dangerous situation. I was in a new apartment. I had a young child, and unbeknown to me, someone was getting ready to break into my house. And every time I would close my eyes to go to sleep, I heard a voice calling me saying, "Don't go to sleep. You need to get up. You need to get up." And I'd close my eyes, and it was a woman's voice. And I really felt it was my mother. She had just passed away a couple of years before, maybe not even 2 years. And she kept saying, "Don't go to sleep. You need to get up. Go to the front door. Go to the front door." And, I knew that every time I close my eyes, she's going to do this again. I better go see what's at the front door. And I got up. And as I got to the front door, I could see somebody had the key to my apartment from whoever lived there before. And I saw the doorknob turning. And I threw my body against the door and held the doorknob and prevented somebody from breaking in. And that would have never happened had I not heard my mother's voice calling to me, telling me, go over there. So, I know it's real. I know that, people who are clairsentient will, but I didn't have a consistent situation with the clairaudience at that time. It was just, in a few rare conditions, or when I'd be doing a lot of readings, I would get that clairaudience kicking in.
Yeah.
And for those who aren't familiar with the clairaudience and all, we call them the clairs. And, clairsentience is you feel something. Clairaudience, you hear something. You have clairvoyant, became clairvoyant in my 40s. And that is when you actually see something. You don't necessarily see it. I see it in my mind's eye. That's where I see it. And I see it like a panoramic view. Some people see things differently. You've also have, what is it? What is the one where you smell something? Claire. Is it Claire? Yeah, I know Claire Goose something. It's the when you taste something. I don't really get that. From time to time, I'll get that. But some people will smell something or taste something. But the clairs are different ways in which psychic and mediumistic skills are going to manifest, and how your senses are going to perceive them. And you can have one, you can have all. You can start off with one and then gradually move to another. But even psychics who are not mediumistic will pick up things in a residual haunting. Going back to residual hauntings, they will still pick up. But I can walk into a room and immediately tell within a few seconds, this is residual. There's nothing active here. This is just residual. But it can be very, very strong.
Another point that should be made, really, to anybody who's developing ability. I've had a lot of budding mediums and developing mediums. They're tuning in all the time. They go to the pub or to a restaurant and they're seeing things with this. That is quite unhealthy. There has to be a time to turn on and off. And you have to learn to activate it. And it's just like reading a book. If you're engrossed in a novel and somebody calls you, it takes you a couple of moments to take your mind away from the characters in the book. They're still playing out inside your head. So you have to realize that mediumship is like that. You have to learn to turn it on and off just by taking your mind away from it. And that's not easy for a lot of people. That's why meditation plays an important part in the manifestation of development, because meditation teaches discipline, it teaches focus, it also teaches you how to respond, to be observant, and it teaches you how to use your peripheral vision. Now, women more than men can use their peripheral vision and their peripheral hearing. You can be engrossed in a conversation with a group of women, but you know full well what's going on across the room in another group. You can hear other people's conversations.
Yes. Yes, you
Women
can.
are like that. It's peripheral hearing. And that is also used in the development of mediumship. People who are not creative, people who have an inability to visualize, will never make a good clairvoyant, because clairvoyance is employed by the image making faculty of the brain. And simple process of staring at the flame of a candle until you can no longer look, and then close your eyes and allow the after image to come into your mind. You do that 3 times. That helps the image making faculty to develop. In Buddhism, it's called the kasina. The after image is called the kasina. And the more you do it, the more responsive your mind will become, the more observant you'll become, the more sensitive you will become. So mediumship is a fascinating subject. It's a process that's never ending. You develop it and develop it and develop it to a fine art. But it can't be used for selfish reasons. You need to use it to help other people.
That's true. That's true. Primarily, the mediumship's job is to give help the grieving and give them hope that their loved ones are able to communicate with them on the other side. That's basically the medium's job, is to prove that there is life on the other side and to give comfort to those who are grieving. That is the primary job of a medium. But mediums can also be used for other things, such as paranormal investigations,
Yeah.
where, if you ask any medium when they walk into a room, the first thing they're going to say is, there's nothing intelligent here. And then they can start telling you about what they're picking up from the residual energy that's there and what they're reading off of that. But any good medium is going to tell you immediately there's no, whether or not there's an intelligent haunting present, because they can sense it. The minute they walk in, they're going to sense it, they're going to feel it or not.
Yeah.
And
The
that's
other thing
important
is,
to realize too.
with skeptics, mediums are damned if they do and damned if they don't. So it doesn't matter how good a medium is, they're still not genuine. And it doesn't matter how bad they are, they're not genuine, as far as it's done. But skeptics are few and far between today, because I think when you look at skepticism, it's good to have a healthy skepticism where the paranormal is concerned. It's fascinating. It is an axiom of physics that no 2 bodies of matter can occupy the same space at the same time. But we know that millions upon millions of vibrations can and do exist in the one space at the same time. So people say to me, well, where is the spirit world? The spirit world is not a place. It's a condition, a transcendental state of being. So our loved ones are walking through and around us, often unaware of our presence, just as we are unaware of their presence. A medium is somebody who's trained to focus, to isolate, and to notice these beings as they walk around you. And once you do that, they begin to notice you. You can't call anybody back. They come back because they want to.
Lost you there for a little
What is
bit.
it?
No, I lost my screen for a bit there. Sorry.
Oh, right.
Yeah, no, that's that's a very, very good point. A lot of people don't realize that, basically that's what we're doing. We're just bridging the gap. That's all we're doing. We're making that connection. And it's all about vibration. It really is. It's all about vibration. Even your residual haunting, when you walk into a haunted building, when you're using this equipment, if you're not a psychic or a medium and you are into the ghost hunting, or you are, or some people make a distinct difference between ghost hunting and paranormal investigation, and to me it's the same thing. But when you walk into these situations and you're getting these meter readings and you're getting these temperature changes, it still can only be indicative of what we call a residual haunting, and you're picking up on this energy, these energy recordings. And all you really have to do is quiet your mind a little bit, and you can sometimes start picking up on that. Even if you're not, mediumistic, you can become attuned to some of the ways that, psychics work, and picking up on that psychic energy and actually feeling it. And after a while, I think anybody can walk into a place and tell, this is residual. This is what this is. But what I think would be tricky, though, with the poltergeist, that's a little tricky because I don't think we always know where the energy's coming from. And it's almost like solving a mystery, trying to figure out where is it coming from. But I think that more often than not, it's not necessarily an angry ghost. It's not just one factor coming in. I think it's multiple factors. Don't you agree?
I agree. There's also something called a clone ball, which is a manifestation of energy that appears in places of enjoyment, such as theaters, even restaurants. And a clone ball is just the energy that's been created over the years. But when it's left, it can precipitate into something else and become almost mischievous. And although it's very rare now, but you do see it, you do experience it in places of enjoyment.
I bet you we have a lot of that in the French Quarter.
Well, when I was there, I noticed the atmosphere was completely different there than in the UK. It was a spiritualized atmosphere. I thought it was quite an enjoyable one. And the hotel we stayed in, apparently the guy who was on duty there said it was once a convent for black nuns. I don't know if you know that.
You were at the Bourbon Orleans. You were at the Bourbon Orleans.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's probably the most haunted, supposedly the most haunted hotel in the French Quarter. And it was the sisters of the original convent that was there. It was right after the Civil War. It was actually during the Civil War. It was a hospital because New Orleans was not part of the Civil War. We were actually occupied by the Union, and we were not actively present, with the war itself. But we had a lot of hospitals. And ironically enough, a lot of them were Union hospitals, but it was a hospital at one time. And originally it was the Grand Ballroom of New Orleans. So you had that effect where people were going there to party. This was the place during the French colonial times. The opera was very, very popular back then. So you had the opera house, and what people would do is that they would go to the opera house on their weeknights or their weekend nights for their enjoyment. And then after the opera, they would go to the ballroom where they would have after parties from the opera house. And it was called the Grand Ballroom of New Orleans. And they had, soirees going on from all over the South would come there and have these parties in this ballroom. And then during the Civil War, it was used as a hospital. And then when the Sisters of the Holy Family came along after the Civil War, and the Sisters of the Holy Family were African American nuns, and they formed a convent there, and they came there to teach the children to read and write. Also, they taught a lot of the little French children English, who were still speaking French. And, what people don't realize is back then we still had those massive yellow fever epidemics. So we still had people dying by the thousands. Yeah. And oftentimes children were left without families. So a lot of the ghosts and hauntings are children in the Bourbon Orleans, because it was also an orphanage at one time. Because anywhere you had a convent, you had an orphanage. So they see children running up and down the halls. There's a little girl that sometimes she's chasing a ball or a doll, or she's walking around with a doll, and you'll see children disappearing into walls and so forth over there. But it's a very, very, very interesting place. There's been... what's that?
The maitre d', he actually said that a lot of the black nuns were murdered. Somebody came in and
I
shot a
never
lot of
heard.
them.
I
No,
never heard of that one. That's interesting. I've
that's
never
what
heard of that.
it
I've
was. An
never heard
elderly
that
black man.
stories. Hmm.
I mean, I've tried to find it on the internet since then for a bit.
I've never heard that.
No,
It's not documented anywhere. I've never ever heard
no,
that.
I couldn't
But
find any
you know, I knew that there
record.
were children there. There were a lot of children
Yeah.
there. And also there was this great story that they all told from over there. There was actually a workman because the stairwell when you walk into the Bourbon Orleans, that stairway to the right is the original stairway that was to the ballroom.
I remember that. Yeah.
And in the 1960s, they brought somebody in, and this is when it became a hotel because eventually the hotel came in, bought it, the nuns went to a convent somewhere else, and they started renovating it to make a hotel out of it, and that staircase was quite old, so they brought in a master carpenter to restore the stairway to its original
Wow. Yeah.
splendor of being the grand ballroom. And he's hammering away one day, he's hammering away on this stairway, and he accidentally hit his thumb with the hammer. Well, of course, he drops the hammer and he blurts out an obscenity. And all of a sudden, he's slapped in the face. And as the story goes, apparently one of the nuns didn't like that language around the children, and she slapped him in the face. And he ran out of the hotel, screaming that the Bourbon Orleans Hotel was haunted, and he never returned for his paycheck.
Oh.
Yes, that's how frightened he was of it. But it was so funny because one night I had a group of school children, they were Catholic school children, and there was a nun on the tour, and she gave me the bravo when she heard the story. She loved the fact that the nun slapped somebody. So the ghost of the nun slapped someone for screaming out an obscenity. But yes, it's a very haunted place. A lot of
But
people have
the
a lot
whole
of experiences there.
ambiance of New Orleans is quite unusual.
But yeah, but back to what you were talking about. Yeah, that would be a very common thing is to have where parties are happening, where festivities, where
Yeah.
people are in that festive holiday mood. You have that kind of atmosphere. So that's not surprising, and it's also not surprising that that kind of energy, if left alone, can become something else because I think that's what happened after
Yeah.
Katrina. Because I saw something very, very strange happen to the French Quarter after Katrina, and it became pretty malevolent because suddenly there's all the partying and everything was gone and some very, very weird things. But we're going to have to save that maybe for next episode, Billy, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that phenomena that
Yeah.
happens, and we'll talk about what happens when that malevolent energy comes along, and also about some of the disembodied spirits that remain in these sorts of situations, and what can happen when they attach to somebody. So we are going to, for now, say to be continued. And Billy, thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us this morning, this afternoon in your case. And
Really
it was
enjoyed
a
it.
pleasure. It was a lot of fun. I always have fun talking about this stuff. And want to thank everybody for tuning in out there and hope you'll join us again for another episode of Afterlife Mysteries. Bye bye for now, folks.
Bye bye.